is happening. So where do you go from here? Where do you go from here? From this conference, from that view of the future. I know we've all had this experience of being in a lightning storm. Maybe you're traveling in the desert, maybe you're on the prairie, maybe you're out in the ocean. It's completely dark. You're not in a lighted area. It's completely dark, but there's a lightning storm, and every now and then the lightning flashes, and for a moment you can see everything, and then the world goes dark. William Irwin Thompson, cultural historian, futurist, philosopher, wrote, and this is a bit philosophical, but I think you'll like it. He wrote the following. He wrote, "The time has come. The revelation has already occurred, and the guardian seers have seen the lightning strike the darkness we call reality. And now we sleep in the brief period between the lightning and the thunder." What he's saying is, we are in between the discovery of what is happening in the world and the decision about what we're going to do about that. And I know that that's where a lot of you are in your organizations. You can see what's going on in the world, and particularly you can see it in flashes. But then the question is, what will you do about it? How can you change? You might go back to your organization and say, let's talk about changing some things, only to discover, as I have over and over again in working with companies and organizations through these years, is that most planning at the end of the day turns out to be a search for a more efficient past rather than a search for a truly new future. You have lots of interesting conversations, but at the end of the day, you've just reorganized the past a little bit. How do you get beyond that? Well, it's a real challenge. Even the best industrialists in the history of the world found it hard to get beyond that challenge. Everybody probably knows what this is. It's a Model T. Henry Ford had a dream, and his dream, interestingly enough, a very powerful vision, was to democratize the automobile, to make an automobile that everybody could own. To do that, he had to build it faster than anybody else and cheaper than anybody else. So what did he do? He didn't invent the assembly line, but he refined the assembly line so that he could manufacture a Model T. At the beginning, it took him 12 hours to assemble a Model T from the manufactured parts. By 12 years later, after the introduction of the Model T, by the early, which was about 1910 to 1912, by the early 1920s, he had it down to 93 minutes. Now, producing it that fast meant that he could make it cheaper. One of the ways he made it cheaper, of course, was to keep it black. He painted all the cars quite famously black because it made the car cheaper. And by the time he could produce one every 93 minutes, he'd gotten the price of a Model T down from $850 to about $280 to purchase a new automobile. But other car companies were beginning to catch up to him. If you look at this car, you'll see that it had a very famous windshield. It has two pieces of glass in this two-part windshield. It has a hand crank as a starter. The gear system consisted of 2 gears plus reverse, which you shifted with foot pedals, not with a hand gear shift. And General Motors and other car companies could see a competitive advantage to them if they could produce a one-piece windshield, add an electric starter, create a new kind of differential and transmission that you could shift using one pedal and a hand shifter, which was much easier. Henry Ford refused to introduce any of those innovations. And as a matter of fact, in 1923 or so, Henry went on a vacation, and some of his engineers secretly produced a new Model T. And they had an electric starter instead of the hand crank, and they had a one-piece windshield, and they had a modern gearbox, and so on. And when Henry, this is a true story, when he came back from vacation, they said, Henry, we want to take you to a showroom. We want to show you the new future of the Ford company. And they brought Henry in, and he took one look at this new Model T with these new features, and what did he do? He kicked in the windshield, smashed the roof, had everybody involved with it reprimanded that were fired, and said he was making no changes in the car because it was the most successful thing that had ever been developed. It, in fact, sold about 15 million of them. At the end of the day, Henry Ford found it very difficult, in fact, in his case, impossible to change that which he himself had created. It is one of the great challenges we have in overcoming resistance to change. You go back to your company, you say, there's all this exciting stuff that's going to be possible and preferred in the future. and immediately you start running into resistance to change. And over time, I learned that there is a pretty useful formula for confronting and overcoming resistance to change. D times V plus FW has to be greater than resistance to change, or nothing will change in your organization. D stands for dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction times vision plus first wins, the first activities that you would do successfully to begin moving in a new direction. Those three things together have to be greater than resistance to change. I worked with a large utility company once, a good example on the D side. They had a very bureaucratic decision-making system, which we've heard a little bit about today. It was overloaded with paper. Nobody would change it. They would complain about it, but nobody would change it. So what they decided to do, it's absolutely a true story, they decided to take every piece of paper that was involved in decision-making, on which they were stuck, and they put it all into one room. So there were piles of paper 6 to 8 feet tall all around this room. And then they required everybody in the company to come through and observe these piles of paper. And it was just a very clever little technique to try to increase the level of dissatisfaction in the company with the current process. You also need a powerful vision, however, and you need some first winning steps, something that you can do that would be successful at the beginning. John Carter is a Harvard University professor who wrote a book about change in the mid-1990s, still teaches this, his 8 steps of change. What he did was study companies and organizations that attempt to make planned change. His conclusion in the 1990s was about 75% of the time when companies set out to make planned change, nothing changes. They go through a lot of planning activities, they have lots of meetings, they say they're going to do things, they try a few things, and they look back a year or two later and really not very much has changed. Only about 25% of the time are they successful. And out of those 25% successful cases, he built 8 key characteristics or steps to making planned change. And here I highlight 4 of them, and you'll see that the first 3 are very familiar from my formula, D times V plus first wins must be greater than resistance. You've got to have a sense of urgency. Now that might be satisfaction, or it might be something that's just so attractive to you, but there must be a sense of urgency. If there's no sense of urgency, nothing's going to change. And if there is no sense of urgency, except for you, you've got to do something to increase that sense of urgency. There has to be an understood and compelling vision. What is Elon Musk's vision for SpaceX? One of the interesting contrasts between SpaceX and other companies that build rockets is most of the other companies that build rockets have one purpose in building their rocket, and that is to try to win a bid from a particular customer, whether it's a government or a private customer. That's it. Their vision is be the lowest bidder, be the best provider. Elon Musk doesn't have that as his vision for SpaceX. Why is Elon Musk doing everything that he's doing with SpaceX? Because his vision is to put 1 million people on Mars before this century is over. That's why people are flocking to work for his company, because he wants to do something that's beyond just building efficient rockets. That's an understood and compelling vision in the case of SpaceX. Small, winnable steps that succeed, and then finally, as we've heard actually several times today, committed senior leadership. I remember early in my consulting career, I had worked with a company. I thought they had made a lot of agreements about change, and then at the end of the day, they decided not to do anything. And I was talking with a fellow, very experienced organizational development consultant, and I said, why did this happen? Why didn't they follow through? And he said, Glenn, in my experience, many senior leaders, including CEOs of companies, really love to talk about change. They're all in favor of change until the moment they realize that things might actually change. And at that point, they start to back off. Successful programs, according to John Carter, that is, successful programs of planned change in organizations include committed senior leadership. So, what is your image of the future at the end of this day? What is your image of the future of the maritime industry and the whole shipping enterprise? And why does that matter? Because your image is exerting an influence over the strategic choices that you make. If you want to change your company, change the future first.